Musicologist Jane. One of my favorite things to do is read aloud or be read to. So I'd like to read you now the program notes that I wrote for the Stockton Symphony's November concerts. Please sit back and enjoy. The first piece is the Fanfare for the Common Man by Aaron Copland. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, November 14th, 1900. So it's fitting that we're doing this piece on the weekend of his birthday. He died in North Tarrytown, New York on December 2nd, 1990. In 1942, conductor Eugene Goossens asked 18 American composers each to write a fanfare as, quote, a stirring contribution to the war effort, unquote. These fanfares would begin the concerts of the Cincinnati Symphony during the 1942-43 season. Copland completed his fanfare in November 1942, finally settling on the unusual title, Fanfare for the Common Man. It was the common man, after all, wrote Copland, who was doing all the dirty work in the war and in the army. He deserved a fanfare. Dramatic percussion rhythms introduce the fanfare's memorable main theme, played by 3 trumpets in unison. Instruments are added in a cumulative fashion, with the fullest texture, 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, tuba, timpani, bass drum, and tam-tam, reserved for the final chord. The Fanfare for the Common Man was first performed by the Cincinnati Symphony on March 12, 1943. The piece was soon played everywhere, for inaugurations, sporting events, television series, occasions marking space exploration, groundbreaking ceremonies, and naturally by all sorts of ensembles. It amazed Copland that even jazz and rock stars wanted to perform it. The Rolling Stones, Woody Herman, tenor saxophonist Gary Anderson, and the group Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They've all adapted it for their own concerts. Copland still preferred the original version, which he himself later quoted and developed in his 3rd symphony. The second piece on our program is the Piano Concerto No. 2 in G minor, Opus 22, by Camille Saint-Saëns. He was born in Paris on October 9, 1835, and died in Algiers, December 16, 1921. A child prodigy whose natural musical abilities rivaled Mozart's, Saint-Saëns possessed a score-reading facility and digital dexterity at the keyboard that dazzled those who came into contact with him throughout his life. Nevertheless, he opted for the life of a composer rather than that of a concert pianist, limiting his public performances almost exclusively to his own works. He premiered all 5 of his piano concertos at the keyboard. Saint-Saëns composed his 2nd piano concerto in only 17 days in 1868 as part of a program to display Anton Rubinstein as a conductor to the Parisian public, who knew him as a virtuoso pianist of Liszt's stature. Saint-Saëns, who played the piano part, wrote of the May 13th premiere in the Salle Pleyel, "Not having had the time to practice it sufficiently for performance, I played very badly. And except for the scherzo, which was an immediate success, it did not go well." The general opinion was that the first part lacked coherence, and the finale was a complete failure. Despite the initial reaction, the concerto has become Saint-Saëns' most popular and widely acclaimed work in the genre. Liszt wrote a detailed critique to Saint-Saëns, saying that the work as a whole pleases me singularly, and regretted that, as an old disabled pianist, he could not appear himself in Paris. Saint-Saëns' deviation from the conventional fast, slow, fast sequence of movements is one of the work's most striking features. The first movement, much admired by Liszt, opens with a piano cadenza, Bach-like at first, that initiates a fantasia-like movement rather than a traditional sonata form movement. The tranquil theme that follows the long introduction was derived from Gabriel Fauré's Tantum Ergo for voice and organ, which Fauré had shown to his teacher Saint-Saëns in the midst of working on the concerto. Of course, the movement does not lack coherence, as is evident by tracing various thematic transformations, but the first audience's reaction may have reflected the composer's non-classical manipulation of those themes. The return of certain material, for example, appears only in the closing cadenza. Instead of a slow movement, Saint-Saëns placed a scherzo second, the rhythm of which Liszt found piquant, and which owes much of its fairyland quality and form to Mendelssohn. Several prominent timpani passages offer a glimpse of Saint-Saëns' orchestrational prowess. The closing movement is an irresistible tarantella, more classical in form than the preceding movements. Bravura and technical skill are combined with inspiration. The driving triplets and trilling piano patterns against a chorale-like background create novel effects, and the whole builds to one of the repertoire's most dazzling finishes. The third piece on our program is one that should have received a lot more attention. This is the Symphony No. 1 in E minor by Florence Price. She was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, April 9, 1887, and she died in Chicago, Illinois, June 3, 1953. During the late 19th century, Little Rock became known as the South's, quote, Negro paradise, end quote, because of the many opportunities available to blacks. Black-owned businesses proliferated, and an 1890 survey showed dozens of cobblers, dressmakers, upholsterers, confectioners, teachers, and ministers, as well as 6 lawyers, 5 physicians, and 1 dentist, Florence's father, Dr. James H. Smith, who believed so strongly in education that he founded several schools. Her mother was an elementary school teacher and pianist, and the family enjoyed an intellectual, art-filled, middle-upper-class life. That began to change with the Jim Crow laws of the 1890s. But precocious, talented Florence was one of the few sent to prestigious northeastern colleges. In her case, the New England Conservatory in Boston. Entering in 1903, Florence studied organ and education there, but also showed an interest in composition. She was lucky enough to be offered a scholarship by the illustrious George Whitefield Chadwick to study with him privately. Like several New England composers who were interested in creating music with indigenous American elements, he had been stimulated by Czech composer Antonín Dvořák, who had set an example in his New World Symphony and other works. Both composers served as inspiration to Florence. At age 19, she graduated from the conservatory, having completed the usual 4-year degree programs in just 3. And she was the only student that year to receive 2 degrees in organ and teaching. Florence returned to teach in Little Rock, sharing the prevailing mission of privileged blacks to give back to the community. 4 years later, her father died, and her mother liquidated all their assets and, quote, disappeared back to her native, more accepting Indiana. Florence moved to Atlanta to become head of the music department at Clark University, now Clark Atlanta University. She returned to Little Rock in 1912 and married Thomas Price, the lawyer who had helped her mother sell her goods, and she began raising a family. She taught locally and composed her own teaching pieces. The Prices probably would have stayed in Little Rock, but racial violence led them to move to Chicago in 1927. Florence had already made some ties there by taking summer courses at the Chicago Music College. She became active in the most important classical music organization for blacks, the National Association of Negro Musicians, acronym NANM. Through the NANM, she met prominent performers, critics, and composers, and her composing career took off. Several firms published her piano pieces and her popular songs. Thomas Price's work tapered off during the Depression, and Florence began to accompany silent films on the organ in order to help the family survive. Her husband became angry and abusive. They divorced in January 1931, and she was granted custody of their 2 daughters. That same month, Florence began composing her symphony in E minor. She entered it the following year in the Rodman Wanamaker competition, sponsored by Robert Curtis Ogden Foundation and the NANM, to offer prizes to African American composers. The symphony won the $500 first prize, and her other entries won recognition as well. Frederick Stock, conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and champion of American composers, took great interest in Price's E minor symphony and decided to perform the work on the orchestra's opening series at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair Century of Progress exhibition. Meanwhile, Price's fame was spreading, and in order to keep up with her commitments, she enlisted friends to help copy out the orchestral parts. One of these friends, pianist Margaret Bonds, who was to perform as soloist with the orchestra on the same program, later said, "During the cold winter nights in Chicago, we used to sit around a large table in our kitchen, manuscript papers strewn around. When we were pushed for time, every brown-skinned musician in Chicago who could write a note would jump to and help Florence meet her deadline." The symphony's performance was a huge success, and she was called out many times to take a bow. It was a momentous occasion, the first time a large-scale work by a black woman composer was played by a major American orchestra. Price's growing recognition included performances of her art songs and spiritual arrangements in recitals by the great Marian Anderson, even on the nationally broadcast Bell Telephone Hour radio program. As Price's music was being performed throughout the United States in the early 1950s, she also received international attention. John Barbaroli, conductor of the Halle Orchestra in England, sent a telegram in 1951 asking her to compose a concert overture based on African American spirituals. That spring, he indeed performed the work, now unfortunately lost. But Price was unable to hear it owing to ill health. She planned another trip to Europe in 1953, centered around an award she was to receive in Paris. But she fell ill again and died after 10 days in the hospital. Most of Price's nearly 300 works were performed during her lifetime, but many remained unpublished and many were lost. Fortunately, in 2009, a number of her manuscripts and other papers were discovered in an abandoned, dilapidated, vandalized house in St. Anne, including 2 violin concertos and her 4th symphony. That discovery together with recent recordings and excellent scholarship by Ray Linda Brown, have helped to refuel interest in her music. Following the standard four-movement format, Price's symphony adopts the same E minor key as Dvorak's famous New World Symphony, and likewise infuses the music with elements from Black spirituals and dances, such as pentatonic, five-note scales, and judicious syncopations, without quoting them directly. The first movement begins with a syncopated bassoon solo that is later used as a counter melody to the surging pentatonic main theme. Price's contrasting second theme opens up a luminous tranquility. Contrapuntal textures abound in the development, followed by a shortened recapitulation that builds to a stormy conclusion. Price's slow movement begins like a hymn, intoned by a brass choir, which suggests her own experience as an organist in church. Again, she relies on the pentatonic scale for her melody. Flutes and clarinets answer the brass phrases in a call and response technique, another connection to her church background. The whole unfolds in a three-part or ABA form. The third movement, Juba Dance, shows Price's roots in the syncopated rhythms of the Pathan Juba folk dance, which traditionally involved foot tapping, hand clapping, chest or shoulder patting, and thigh slapping to the accompaniment of fiddle and banjo. Price used the juba as the basis for several of her works. Here the juba is in rondo form, a refrain interspersed by contrasting episodes. The slide whistle adds to the movement's lighthearted character. Price's energetic finale also exhibits dance-like and rondo characteristics. Its propulsiveness has much to do with its constant rippling three-note figures in 6/8 meter. After a brief pause, the movement culminates in a whirlwind blaze of sound. The work is scored for 2 flutes doubling piccolo, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 4 horns, 2 trumpets, 3 trombones, tuba, timpani, snare drum, cymbal, bass drum, triangle, large and small African drums, crash cymbals, wind whistle, celesta, cathedral chimes, orchestral bells, and strings.